the light is in my eyes. Good evening. Thank you. I'm delighted to see you all. Thank you for coming. I'm Ida Eblinger-Kelly. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. Many of you are familiar with the library here, but for those of you who aren't, we are part of the National Archives and a member of the Presidential Library System. We house millions of papers, tapes, video, artifacts associated with the Nixon presidency. And which brings us obviously to this lovely program we have tonight. I'm keeping it really short because I know the other folks are much more interesting than I am. Joining us today is our moderator, Alan Lowe. Alan is the director of the George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum. Alan will guide us this evening with the thoughtful contingent of scholars we have today. I know we all look forward to hearing the discussion of President Nixon, what it meant in his resignation, and what it means to us today. So help us welcome Alan, who will kick off the evening for us.
Thank you. Thank you all so very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight at the wonderful Nixon Library and Museum in such distinguished company to discuss a really momentous time in our nation's history. I want to thank Ida, thank Susan Donius, the acting director here, thank my good friend Greg Cumming for everything you all have done to be so welcoming and to put together a really terrific program. On August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency. Our chief executive, the man just elected 2 years before that by a huge majority, resigned from an office that has long helped define and symbolize our nation, arguably the most important job in the world. Richard Nixon, as I'm sure you know, had spent a life in politics with a very distinguished record of public service that equals almost any other in our country's history. Along the way, he had gathered devoted supporters and, shall we say, equally devoted detractors. Ever since his election to Congress in 1946, Nixon had helped define the American century, a century he put a stamp on as he rose to the Senate, to the vice presidency, and ultimately to the presidency. Once he finally attained the White House in 1968, his administration confronted enormous challenges and saw many successes in both the foreign and domestic spheres. But all that promise and all that history, all of it came crashing down amidst the Watergate scandal. I recall, when I was asked to do this, I recall very vividly the president's speech to the nation on August 8th, 1974, watching it with my family. As the president told the nation of his plans to resign effective on noon the next day, we were all stunned, like the rest of the nation. No matter what you felt about Watergate or about President Nixon or other political forces that were swirling around in our capital and around our country, we all knew that our nation was in trouble. And we could only hope that the new president could help calm the waters and right the ship. And I believe President Ford did that. I think overall history is treating him extraordinarily well for his actions those first days and the first month after the resignation. Of course, President Nixon came back here to California and, as you know, had yet another great rebirth, emerging as a much consulted senior statesman. Now, our purpose here today is not to refight the wars of Watergate or to examine that scandal in infinite detail. Goodness knows that has been done a few times before and will continue to be done. But of course that whole affair forms part of the broader context, a big part of the broader context of our discussion. What I hope to do tonight is both narrower than that and broader all at the same time. I want to put a spotlight on and look narrowly at the resignation. Why did the president decide to resign? How did he come to that decision? How was that decision put into effect? How was it viewed here and around the world? How did our government deal with it, and how did we move on those first days and first months afterwards? But also, if we have time, and I have about 1 billion questions, I told we have many nights worth of questions here, ladies and gentlemen, but if we have time, I'd also like to look at it a bit more broadly. I think sometimes we put on Watergate blinders a bit and see things only in the context of that scandal. But I'd instead like to look at it how the resignation relates to other major events, how it can be compared to perhaps the Clinton impeachment proceedings or reactions to other presidential scandals, how the act of resignation affected or did not affect the political history of our nation to the present day. So that is what I think we're going to talk about. I'm sure my panelists will have their own ideas as we go down the road. So with that, we're going to start tonight with some remarks from Dr. Daniel Frick, and then we'll bring the panel up for a further discussion. So with that, let me introduce to you our first speaker. Daniel Frick is a professor of American Studies at Franklin and Marshall College and director of the Writing Center. He obtained his master's and PhD at Indiana University. I think he's the perfect person to begin our proceedings today. He's been studying and teaching about Richard Nixon as a cultural icon for a long time now, and he wrote the truly fascinating book titled Reinventing Richard Nixon, A Cultural History of an American Obsession. He also told me today that he started work on a book focused on the Frost-Nixon interviews as well, which I very much look forward to. So Dan will start our discussion, and then when he's finished with his remarks, I'll welcome the rest of the panel to the stage. So with that, please welcome Daniel Frick.
Thank you, Alan, and good evening, everyone. Okay, we're getting the clicker working here. Oops, there we go. Work backwards. All right. So my charge for the first 15 minutes of this evening was to talk about the resignation in popular culture, as that's been my special area, looking at Nixon as a popular culture icon. So my talk we're calling Scenes of a Resignation, the Nixon Resignation in Popular Culture. And being a consensus kind of guy, I thought, well, let's start with one thing that we can all agree on. And I came up with Richard Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974. But that's just a point on a timeline. History must explain, and an explanation of Nixon's resignation can only come from telling a story about it. And if the widely divergent stories that we tell about the resignation in popular culture give any indicator, the shape of that narrative frame is far from certain. In this episodic tour, the conflicting ways in which the resignation has been represented and remembered in U.S. popular culture, we'll see the resignation dramatized as relief, as nightmare, as cover story, as sacrifice, as failed reform, as ordinary, as partisan football, and as a hoped-for reconciliation. Taken together, these scenes suggest that even 40 years on, there's much that remains unresolved about the meaning of President Nixon's resignation and, by extension, about America itself. So, scene one, resignation as relief. For most, the resignation came as tremendous relief. After his swearing in, Gerald Ford comforted an exhausted nation that our long national nightmare is over. Two late summer 1974 Doonesbury strips offered these iconic representations of our awakening from that collective bad dream. First, in a cartoon drawn before the resignation, G.B. Trudeau shows a Nixon White House that had stonewalled itself off from the country. The post-resignation bookend begins where the earlier cartoon finished, but now, bit by bit, the wall comes down, allowing the viewer to see a still standing White House, illuminated by a brilliant sunrise cutting through the low-lying clouds. Much of the contemporary press coverage hailed, as Ford had, the resiliency of our government, demonstrating what scholar Michael Schudson has called the system worked school of thought about Watergate. On the day the resignation took effect, the Boston Globe added a banner between its masthead and the headline offering a replica of the Constitution's preamble. Los Angeles Times cartoonist Paul Conrad's piece on Sunday, August 11th, depicted a torn but repaired Constitution, the damage visible, yet the document still legible. And if the system worked, the thanks belonged, or so many thought, to a watchful we the people. On August 9th, Herb Bloch's cartoon displayed a massive arm with a cufflink labeled U.S., dictating the resignation by holding the paper in place for a tiny Nixon to sign. Soon, however, popular culture's treatment of Watergate began to give more credit to the Fourth Estate, and particularly to reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. All the President's Men, the top seller on the New York Times nonfiction list on August 9, 1974, and the 1976 Alan J. Pakula film did much to promote the image of the press as guardian of democracy. But it was Woodward and Bernstein's follow-up, The Final Days, that for many set indelibly their image of Nixon during the resignation period and more than any other, one passage from that book became emblematic. Nixon's insistence on the night before the announcement that Henry Kissinger join him in prayer, kneeling in the Lincoln sitting room. Henry, the president, was reported to have said, "You are not a very Orthodox Jew, and I am not a very Orthodox Quaker, but we need to pray." From the famous Franken and Davis Final Days sketch for the May 8, 1976 broadcast of Saturday Night Live, the Carlson for President episode from the 1979 fall season of WKRP in Cincinnati, Oliver Stone's movie Nixon, released nationwide in January 1996, and 10 years later, in day 5 of 24, TV and film writers have returned to this moment, alternatively fascinated, amused, and appalled. These familiar images can so dominate the thinking about the resignation that many forget that for millions of Americans, the nightmare of Watergate was the resignation itself, a glaring indicator that the system didn't work. Take, for example, Burlington Free Press editor Franklin B. Smith's collection of Watergate editorials titled "The Assassination of President Nixon." Smith's August 8, 1974 Jeremiad titled "Hatred Engulfs America" attacks a duplicitous press and a gullible public and laments America's loss of national greatness. Quote, "Land of the free and home of the brave? Not today. Perhaps no more. The heart of America stopped beating this week." And Smith was not alone. Richmond, Virginia news leader cartoonist Jeff McNally rendered Nixon being forced to walk the Constitution's plank, a form of execution for ship's captains traditionally practiced by pirates and mutineers. On Resignation Day, the Dayton Daily News reported that in Findlay, Ohio, recognized by congressional resolution as Flag City, USA, a city councilman would be flying the flag at half-staff at his home and place of business, quote, "in distress and mourning," close quote, over the resignation. The largest town close to Deschler, Ohio, the site of the Whistle Stop campaign rally in 1968, where the Bring Us Together sign had been spotted, Findlay could have served as the capital city of the silent majority, and one of its elected officials was still standing by his president. Blaming Mr. Nixon for Watergate, he said, was a conspiracy trying to break down the morals of America. Even the Washington Post provided a forum for such views. Of the 27 letters to the editor about the resignation printed in the paper immediately following the event, 9 of them supported the president, and many of those excoriated the media as undemocratic and habitually biased. One man wrote of his, quote, "undying enmity," close quote, for the key role the Post had played in, quote, "weakening the independency of the presidency," imparting an inventive closing insult that echoed Johnny Carson's Karnak the Magnificent. Quote, "May a rabid camel sit on your lap and nibble your ear." Many on the far left in the decades following Watergate came to their own conspiracy theories, seeing the resignation as a cover story to mask the truth of how the system really works. Robert Altman's 1984 film Secret Honor depicts a post-resignation Nixon taping a 90-minute monologue confession of the, quote, "reasons behind the reasons" for his resignation. If this Nixon is to be believed, and the film doesn't resolve this question at all, the former president served as the puppet of business interests that hungered after untapped Asian markets. These shadowy power brokers required him to continue the Vietnam War through 1976 and beyond. In fact, they had planned to arrange a third term for Nixon, a campaign that would be financed by millions of dollars of U.S. aid that South Vietnam redirected to the committee to re-elect to use 4 years later. Having had enough of this power elite's corruption, Nixon committed Watergate's minor crimes, orchestrating the tapes like, quote, "a great drama," to sabotage their schemes. In this telling, the resignation was a sacrificial act. The president saves the nation by making himself an outcast. Conservatives had their own version of Nixon as sacrificial lamb. It's an interpretation rooted in the resignation speech itself. The August 9, 1974 morning final edition of the Orange County Register added to its banner, "Nixon Resigns," the explanatory subheadline, "In Interest of Nation." 16 years later, attempting to combat the conventional wisdom that Nixon was forced to resign because the June 23, 1972 tape revealed his guilt in the Watergate cover-up, The original Nixon Library Museum insisted that the president had remained in control of events. The key section of reader boards titled "The Decision to Resign" emphasized the president's deliberate actions. By August 5th, 1974, Nixon, quote, had decided that he could not ask the nation to endure the agony of an impeachment debate, close quote. 9 years later, Bill Clinton's impeachment proved a useful tool in reinforcing this point. Docent-led museum tours as late as 2002 would contrast Clinton's choice to see what would happen with the impeachment process to Nixon's decision not to exercise that option because of his desire to bring us together. In this compact morality play, Bill Clinton's egotism contrasts with a Nixon who so loved his country that he surrendered the presidency rather than prolong the nation's trauma. By century's end, the exhaustion following the Clinton impeachment and trial fostered a cynical reevaluation of Nixon's resignation. Debunking the idea that the system worked, the 1999 Columbia Pictures film Dick declared a pox on all houses. In writer-director Andrew Fleming's spoof, Nixon's fall results not from the heroics of Woodward and Bernstein, who are portrayed as two dim-wittedly vain bumblers, but from the investigatory efforts of two ditzy 15-year-old girls who stumbled by blind luck into the inner circles of the Nixon administration as, quote, secret youth advisors. But their victory has no permanent effect. Out shopping when the president resigns, the girls watch the speech on a department store television display, unable to resist self-satisfied smiles. It's going to be different now, one insists, a proclamation that the other affirms with a heartbreakingly naive prediction: they'll never lie to us again. During the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations, imagining presidential resignation seemed to get easier and easier. On 24, Fox's popular real-time national security drama, presidents proved as disposable as Kleenex. And it wasn't just the obvious Nixon lookalike character, Charles Logan, who suffered this fate. Including Logan, 24 managed in 9 seasons to have 4 of 8 presidents resign. 1 due to a withdrawal from a re-election bid because of a blackmail threat, that's day 3. 2 due to corruption, it's day 5 and day 8. And 1 to Alzheimer's, live another day, the most recent season. The unthinkable was now routine. Meanwhile, the trench warfare between the Nixon critics and loyalists continues. Just this fall, Harry Shearer released his web series, Nixon's the One, consisting of verbatim recreations of what are meant to be perceived as damning, or just damn strange, moments from the White House tapes. In the episode titled TV, Nixon's resignation speech takes up over 1/4 of the entire program, except that we don't see the speech so much as we do the president's awkward bantering with the CBS crew before and just after the broadcast. By emphasizing his inept efforts at small talk, trying to joke about the White House photographer, I'm afraid he'll catch me picking my nose, and his 4-month premature parting wish to the crew to have a Merry Christmas, fellas, Nixon's the One means for its audience to feel how lucky the country was to be rid of this odd man. By contrast, Jackson Place, a fascinating alternate history novel by former Nixon Library director John H. Taylor, imagines a United States lucky enough to not have gotten rid of Richard Nixon. What if the president had not resigned on August 9, 1974, but instead exercised the 25th Amendment's temporary incapacity clause? Well, what happens is that Gerald Ford takes over as acting president, and Nixon moves to a townhouse on the west side of Lafayette Park, from which he prepares to face his Senate trial. This temporary abdication allows Watergate passions to cool, and for sympathetic senators to begin to turn around the vote count in the president's favor. In a narrative that manages both on the one hand to cede Nixon's involvement in Watergate and to imagine ways in which Nixon might have weathered the storm, Jackson Place, at least at first, and I'm not going to go any further than this because I don't want to do spoilers. Go read it. Mr. Taylor's here. It's a wonderful read. Treats impeachment and resignation at first as a political process. Against this background of partisan infighting, there are some treatments of the resignation in popular culture that try to use the event as a vehicle for forgiveness and healing. Russell Leese's 1996 play, Nixon's Nixon, returns to that Kissinger-Nixon prayer session, but with a unique twist. Using an unpublished incriminating tape transcript, Nixon desperate to do anything to stay in power, blackmails his Secretary of State into agreeing to covertly provoke a nuclear crisis that only Nixon could resolve. Yet, having forged a weapon by which he could hold on to the presidency, he rediscovers his conscience and refuses to pull the trigger. Far from the usual satiric send-up, this version of Nixon in prayer comes across as a soul-searching moment. Quote, "Help me realize that sometimes the courageous thing isn't to struggle on. Sometimes it takes more courage, more honor to throw in the towel. Can't you help me realize that?" Here, resignation becomes a genuinely heroic act. And finally, Michael Cahill's 1998 novel, A Nixon Man, takes that farewell moment on the helicopter steps to complete a narrative about a reconciliation within a warring family. Cahill's book tells the story of a boy growing up during the Watergate years who comes to appreciate the quiet virtues of his father, a steadfast Nixon believer who refuses to quit, despite a life of failed dreams and a very troubled marriage. Watching his father watch Nixon leave the White House, knowing that his dad knows but will never be able to acknowledge that Nixon had lied, the son finds a way to forgive and to trust his father again. Quote, "Lately everyone had been leaving, even the president. My father was staying, though. I knew that now for sure. He was not the kind of man who left." Here, in fiction at least, Nixon finally does bring people together. When Henry Kissinger tried to comfort Nixon after the resignation speech by declaring that history would treat him kindly, the president responded wryly, "That depends, Henry, on who writes the history." And as this tour of popular culture's scenes of a resignation shows, we have plenty of competing first drafts of history still in play. To take just the two most dominant ones, does Richard Nixon's resignation show us that America's constitutional system can function even when a corrupt president tries to block it? Or does it suggest that a cynical political minority and a biased news media can circumvent the electoral process? The answer that wins out in this struggle matters greatly, because when we fight about Richard Nixon, we are fighting about the meaning of America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Wonderful way to start our evening. Now joining me on stage, I can welcome our other panelists. First of all, Evan Thomas, a noted journalist and writer who served for many years with Newsweek and Time. He's a graduate of Harvard, University of Virginia as well, and has served in academia, including service as the Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton. He's the author of a wonderful number of books, including Robert Kennedy, His Life, The Wise Men, Six Friends and the World They Made, and a really terrific book I read recently, Ike's Bluff, President Eisenhower's Secret Battle to Save the World. He's currently working on a biography of President Nixon, so I cannot wait to read. And we also are joined by Barry Werth, an acclaimed journalist and author as well. His most recent book, The Antidote, joins many others, such as The Scarlet Professor and Banquet at Delmonico's, that have won numerous awards. He's also had articles in New York Times Magazine, GQ, among many other publications. He too has taught, including service at Smith College, Mount Holyoke College, and Boston University. His wonderful book, 31 Days, Gerald Ford, The Nixon Pardon, and a Government in Crisis, will do much to inform our discussion this evening. So thank you, panelists, for joining us, and now we begin our discussion. As I said, I have probably 500 questions here to ask you, gentlemen, so I ask for your apologies right up front here. I give you my apologies right up front for overburdening you tonight with this, but it's going to be a great discussion, I know. I want to start with some words from President Nixon as we begin our discussion. In his first book, Six Crises, President Nixon said, "The easiest period in a crisis situation is actually the battle itself. The most difficult is the period of indecision, whether to fight or run away." In every other battle in this man's life, his case, the fun crisis, the coming back after the defeats of 1662, he fought hard. He was a fighter. Admittedly a broad question, but let's begin broadly. Why this time did he admit defeat and resign the office? Maybe Evan, will start with you.
The short answer is he didn't have the votes. Nixon was a really smart politician, a great vote counter, and he and Bill Timmons, his congressional liaison guy, spent a lot of time counting votes in the summer of 1974. And they realized by about mid-July that President Nixon didn't have the votes to stop an impeachment movement in the House, and probably not in the Senate either. The key was, to get into the weeds here, Southern Democrats.
Right.
When Nixon realized that he had lost the 3 Southern Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee, he basically said, we're toast. The climactic moment came when he called George Wallace. Now, why was that significant? George Wallace, as you know, had run in 1968 as an independent, got 13% of the vote. There was an assassination attempt in 72, so he didn't run, but he was a political force. And Nixon had played this game with him for years with the carrots and sticks, trying to keep him on the right side. And so when they started counting votes and Nixon realized that he was losing Southern Democrats, he called George Wallace and basically said, "Are you with me, George?" Because he needed Wallace, and Wallace pretended that he said, "I'm not sure why you're calling. I haven't seen the evidence. I can't really hear you. I'm praying for you." Finally, he said, "No." And Nixon hung up the phone, and he turned to Al Haig, and he says, "There goes the presidency." Now, that's not the night he decided that it was over, but it was a pretty good sign to him that the political reality, and Richard Nixon was a realist, was exceedingly grim. It took him another couple of weeks and several iterations to get to the resignation point. But that was a pretty big moment when he realized that he can count the votes, and he didn't have them.
And that's a key part of the narrative in RN, the memoirs, and also then in the Frost interviews, is putting that date at July 23rd, because that's the day before the Supreme Court decision comes in. So that, to Frost, Nixon's answer is, "I decided on July 23rd. That's when I knew it." Others, I had to listen to other people, but in my own mind, I didn't particularly waver from that point.
So do you think it was that earlier, or was it perhaps earlier than that? Did he know at some point that tape was going to be made public? That was a possibility, at least. Was the thought in his mind before then, even weeks, if not months before that? What do you think, Barry?
I think he thought he might survive. As Evan said, I think it was the turning of those Southern Democrats on the Judiciary Committee that really made the difference. But by that point, all 3 branches of government had turned against Richard Nixon, including the executive branch. After it was clear that he wasn't going to survive in the Congress, and after the release of the tape, Gerald Ford, who was the vice president, pulled back and stopped supporting him. George H.W. Bush, who was the head of the Republican Party, withdrew himself. So, all of his support had evaporated. It wasn't simply that he couldn't get through Congress. There was no place for him to turn at that point.
Nixon was a very curious mixture of optimist and pessimist. The scene I love is that he loved watching movies. He watched something like 500 movies in the White House, and he was sat through some real dogs, his daughters said, and they'd get up to leave. Or B.B. Rebozo would fall asleep, and they'd all leave. Nixon would be saying, "Oh, wait, it'll get better, it'll get better." And William Safire said that's sort of the way he approached his own resignation. He was playing for time, and he kept hoping against hope that something would turn, that it would get better, that even though his enemies were against him, and he believed that and was not wrong, he kept hoping for a break. Eventually, he realized the break wasn't going to come, and he had to be realistic. But it took a long time. And even after this moment with the votes, when his family, actually, the last people to give up on Richard Nixon was his own family, his wife and his daughters. They really did not want him to resign. So even though he says on the 23rd, "There goes the presidency," it takes a couple of weeks, and he changes his mind a couple of times along the way of deciding to fight, even after it seems pretty hopeless.
There was a cabinet meeting, and there was not, where he began the meeting by wanting to talk about inflation. Is that correct? Is that? I remember reading that. That's where there was a confrontation by some cabinet members.
Yeah. In Nixon's telling, that comes, the bit about inflation comes a little way into the cabinet meeting. The beginning is him giving an indicator for them to not make statements about the process, that he felt that it was important, that it not be seen that he was being pressured by the cabinet to stand out, and so that this gave the impression that he was going to be staying. I believe as William Simon comes out after and says the president's going to stay, and that sends out headlines. The next day, the president's not going to resign on Wednesday. But then, yes, he's going to turn to the thing that is on the minds of most Americans, and that's inflation.
I think it was the Attorney General, William Saxby, who said, no, Mr. President, we need to talk about whether you can remain in office. So the cabinet at that point also stopped him in his tracks.
So in your minds, I know he was visited by Goldwater, other Republican leaders. At that point, you think he had already he knew what they were saying to him was correct, or was that the final straw?
In this case, that's Tuesday. By Tuesday at 4:20, Ray Price gets the word that the resignation speech is on again.
Right.
Price had started writing a draft the Thursday or Friday before that, had been told to stop. And the June 23rd tape's released on Monday, and they're testing the reaction. And by the end of the day, Tuesday, then things are irrevocable.
Yeah. But you reminded me of our conversation earlier. If we can talk a little bit about the kind of the machinery of the resignation, of the process, the announcement, the speech to the nation, the resignation letter, the farewell in the White House. Perhaps we can start by talking a bit about the drafting of that resignation speech. I know, Dan, you talked earlier today to me about what you've learned about that process thus far that week. Yeah.
A very interesting genesis of that, and over a very short period of time. So it's Tuesday at 4:20. Chief speechwriter Ray Price is called in, and Al Haig says we need 1,000 words, and probably Thursday night, but maybe tomorrow. And so it ends up being Thursday, slightly more than 48 hours, and in that period of time, the president and Price working together in just a lightning collaboration that's fascinating. They get through fully 5 drafts, and draft 4 and 5 have some sub-drafts to them as well that move the speech, which was supposed to be 1,000 words, sort of bare bones, not a breastfeeding mea culpa, but a healing speech. One that sets up the nation to support Jerry Ford and the challenges that we have. That's kind of what draft 1 was. Between draft 1 and 2, you can see in Nixon's hand, he's written in a couple of things. One is, I've met with the leadership who tell me that I don't have the support. That was actually written an hour before the leadership actually showed up to give him that message. And then the famous language, I have never been a quitter, that Nixon writes in the second draft. So they go working along those lines. Draft 3 is supposed to appear on Nixon's desk the next morning. So they're in for Tuesday, they've been writing through Wednesday. Nixon writing from his office in the old executive office building. Ray Price's office is just down the hall. They're trading drafts back and forth. Nixon says, give me draft 3, put it on my ottoman in the EOB. He goes back to the residence, and that's when he meets with the family. Those famous pictures in the solarium are taken. Tricia goes with him down to the Rose Garden, and they walk together. Later that evening, then, is when Henry Kissinger comes to the Lincoln sitting room and they have the prayer session. And the fascinating thing to me as I've been looking at the drafts of that speech over the last day is to realize that it's after the Kissinger meeting that Nixon calls Ray Price, about 35 minutes after Kissinger was supposed to have left, and said, I would really like to add in something about our foreign policy achievements. Could we talk about China? Could we talk about the Mideast? Things that he had just been talking about with Kissinger sort of during that session. And that starts through the night, back and forth between the two of them, in which they kind of meld 2 drafts together and decide that they'll talk about ending the Vietnam War, and they'll talk about détente with the Soviets along with those 2 other things. And that they'll look to the future as well with the challenges that are coming along. And so that the speech that was supposed to be 1,000 words ends up being about 1,800, and the speech that we know now. But a really interesting collaborative process between two people who knew each other very, very well. It was very interesting to see.
Well, let's contrast that just a second, the speech to the nation versus his remarks to the White House staff and the people who gathered there on the day of the resignation. Were those remarks written, or was that all
There's one
spontaneous?
one page of notes. Nixon tells Frost that he still has them. He did those Friday morning, waking up. He thinks at 4 o'clock, but it's actually 6:30. His watch had stopped on the last day in the White House. And he has time to scribble down one page of notes, but he knows that he's going to do it mostly extemporaneously. And so that that's how the farewell happens.
In the interest of time, I want to jump to another probably unfair question to you, a broad question, but let me just throw this out there. In all the sources you read about this period of indecision where the president's coming to this momentous decision, went back and forth. I think Al Haig said he went up and down the mountain several times. But at one point, President Nixon tells Gerald Ford that it might be easier to resign, but he won't do that to the office. He said his resignation would turn the presidency into a parliamentary-like leadership office that would forever weaken it for future occupants of the White House. Since then, of course, we've lived in a world of independent counsels and special prosecutors and so forth. So, in a way, was perhaps Richard Nixon right, and we now see the continued efforts by Congress in subsequent years to impeach and prosecute presidents. Was he right in that regard?
Yes. I mean, the biggest, I think you have to look at Nixon's resignation in a way as the end of the 60s. And what do I mean by that? The end of the assault on authority. He was the ultimate authority figure. And the 60s are this long period of attacks on authority, mostly teenagers against their parents, but all sorts of institutions. The Catholic Church has a rough time in the 1960s. All churches do. The draft produces all sorts of draft resistance. Universities, states of upheaval. My freshman year in college, 400 universities shut down over Kent State. We just stopped going to school. And this enormous revolution against authority that had a lot of roots culminates in deposing a president. And I contrast my own, I became a journalist shortly thereafter and spent 30 years as a journalist. And during those 30 years in Washington where I worked, you could argue that the real power lay with the watchdogs, not with the people in power, but the people who were supposed to be the check on power. And so much of that was a product of Watergate. The special prosecutors that you mentioned, all those scandals with Gate on the end, Korea Gate and Iran Gate and all those gates. There was a perpetual scandal machine that was just running all the time. I was part of it, working for Time and Newsweek. And it was the fruits of it was the culmination of this challenge to authority that it kind of crescendos with Nixon, but then continues on for decades until they finally get rid of the Special Prosecutor Act. And I think that period, in a way, generalizing a little bit here, but in a way ends with 9/11. I mean, as a journalist, I felt there had been this long period of attacks on authority by congressional investigating committees, working with journalists, working with various lawyers to attack pretty much everybody in power. And with 9/11, that machine kind of dialed back a little bit because we felt our existence threatened in a way. Maybe we were overreacting, but we did after 9/11. And the press became more, for a time, more muted.
So the fellow I work with right now might disagree with that a bit, right?
It did reassert itself, but there was at least a break in the action, so to speak. But I think there's a watershed here that is all about challenging authority.
So did it, in a way, turn our political battles into legal ones, in a way? Right?
That was a piece of it. I mean, the rise of the press as severe, aggressive, challenging watchdogs. I wrote a book about Dwight Eisenhower. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower did not have to deal with anything like what President Nixon had to deal with. There's just no comparison. The press was pretty docile in the 1950s. Eisenhower did not have to endure the same scrutiny and challenge that Richard Nixon did.
I think before we get too much further ahead into the actual resignation itself, it's important to think about Richard Nixon's state of mind, even before he made the final decision. On August 1st, which was a week before he went on television to say that he was leaving, Al Haig went to Gerald Ford's office in the executive office building with the message, "Are you ready to take over if this is going to happen?" And he brought with him a document that had been drawn up by Nixon's lawyer, Fred Bizarre, which were various permutations about how this might occur. And the last three involved pardons. One was that Nixon pardon himself and then leave. One was that Nixon pardon everybody involved and then leave. And the third was that Nixon leave and Ford pardon Nixon. And Ford listened to this. He took it in. He didn't commit himself one way or another. And then the next morning, he told his closest aides, Ford that is, Bob Hartman and John Marsh, about this. And they said, "You've got to immediately call Haig back and say that nothing that you discussed yesterday afternoon should be construed in any way as a deal." Because the fear was, of course, that Ford would trade for the presidency, give Nixon the pardon. So they brought in Bryce Harlow, who was a former Nixon aide, and they wrote up a document that Ford read over the phone, and it said, "Nothing that you and I discussed yesterday afternoon should be interpreted in any way as a deal for the presidency." In fact, this remains the mystery to me. During the night, there was a phone call between Haig and Ford. In his memoirs, Ford said that Haig called him at 1 a.m. and said, "The situation's still fluid. I just wanted to let you know." What Hartman recalled is that Ford came to him in the morning and said, "Betty and I talked about it last night. We decided the country can't go through this anymore. And I called Haig and I said, 'Do whatever you've decided to do. I will support it.'" Now, getting back to Nixon, one can easily imagine that Haig goes to Nixon and says, "You don't have to worry. You're going to be able to leave office. You're not going to be indicted. Ford will pardon you, and you'll have your presidential papers from which you can begin to rebuild your legacy." We don't know about that phone conversation. In a subsequent interview many years later with Bob Woodward, Ford acknowledged that he did in fact call Haig at night. It wasn't Haig who called him, but that he just said, I'm prepared and I'm ready. So in that question, I think, still remains some doubt about whether, in order for Richard Nixon, who, as we know, was a very smart politician and was certainly concerned about his future, that in his mind, he was able to make the decision the next day with the family on August 2nd that he was going to leave. So at least it's been, from the research I've been able to do, it seems fairly clear that Nixon made his decision feeling rather strongly that he was not going to be indicted, that Gerald Ford would be merciful towards him, and that he would get his presidential papers, which ultimately he did not because of the negotiations around the pardon, but we can talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, let's do it, if you don't mind going on. I want to talk about your book. You really did an excellent job of showing how President Ford dealt with an unprecedented responsibility, really, of leading the nation in the wake of a resignation. Could you perhaps just briefly tell us what President Ford's main priorities were those first few days, that first week and first month?
Ford's memoir is called A Time to Heal, and the nation needed healing. There was no question. If anything, you mentioned before how exhausted the country was, but the country was torn apart by 20 months of controversy about this. I may be overstating it a bit, but certainly a year and a half of one escalating shock after another. And Ford came in and felt very strongly that he had no authority or no mantle that he had inherited, but what he did have was what one commentator called the mantle of the presidential center. Everybody wanted this to be resolved, for the country to move forward again. And I think Jerry Ford did an amazing job during those first couple of weeks. He he was under enormous pressure, obviously. I mean, first of all, he had not wanted to be president. He only became president because because the Democrats in Congress wouldn't agree to anybody else. In fact, when Spiro Agnew resigned, Nixon had hoped to make John Connally his vice president, but he never could have gotten that through Congress. So Jerry Ford, because he did not have the ambition to be president, because he had not planned to run in 1976, he himself considered that he was taking over as a caretaker. He felt that his job was to take over and start to assert the authority of the presidency, which had pretty much been dissipated during these last couple of months, and then bring the country together. So every move he made was towards the center. The first big decision he made was to choose his own vice president, and he chose Nelson Rockefeller, which infuriated the right. In fact, it was before that, Ronald Reagan had not really taken seriously the notion of challenging for the nomination in 1976, but the conservatives were so angry about the Rockefeller choice that they started to mobilize. He started talking about amnesty for draft resistors, which is something that Nixon had refused to do. He went to and courageously, I think, he went to the annual convention of the VFW in Chicago to announce that he was thinking about this. He chose not a hand-selected audience that would support him, but the toughest audience he could find. He started meeting with women's organizations. There's a famous picture of him with Bella Abzug behind him. Yeah. Inconceivable that Bella Abzug would have gone up to the White House to be photographed with the president before that. Started meeting with the Black Caucus. So his notion was bring the country to the center. And then 1 month later, he pardoned Nixon, a surprise announcement. It had not been previously discussed. The country seemed to be moving on and sort of forgetting about Watergate, at least temporarily. And then after that, his popularity plummeted, and it never recovered.
What do you think? I know in preparing for this evening, I saw in some of the literature some theories that if Spiro Agnew had not been forced out of office, that Congress would have been much less eager to take on the president and force President Nixon. What do you think about that?
The joke in the White House was that Agnew was the insurance policy.
So this may be an unfair question as well to you, Dan. When we talk about the kind of the cultural legacy of Richard Nixon, and this is one of those theoreticals that all panelists dislike. What if there had been no Watergate? What if the Richard Nixon we know had other issues, Vietnam and so forth, but if there had been no Watergate, no resignation, would he still loom as large as he does in our cultural memory today?
Yeah, probably not. Probably not.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that I saw it that way when I was working on my first book, but as you know, the lens of this particular symposium, looking at this, that you know, I was writing before, looking at the resignation, I thought this period of exhaustion, the relief, that was, you know, generalizing out, that was everybody. And as I started to look at the look at the evidence of what was out there in popular culture, was no, this is exactly what I was writing about in other places, and that if anything, it just intensifies the questions. So that sure, there would be a lot of Nixon in sort of anti-Vietnam stage plays from the 70s and things like that, but the kind of stuff that we've been seeing and continue to see 20 years after his death, no, I don't think we'd have.
I think we would have gotten the Reagan Revolution a little earlier. I mean, just this morning in the reading room I was reading, Nixon was really determined in the fall of 1972 to conduct a post-landslide change in government. He thought he was going to have a big mandate. He knew he was going to win by a lot. And he had this idea of a new American majority that was going to bring back square America, as he put it, patriotic, stronger America, anti-permissiveness, anti-welfare state, and that he was going to try to attack the bureaucracy, which he hated, Now, whether any of this would have worked, I'm not sure, but he would have brought a frontal assault on big government in that second term. I don't know how it would have turned out, but it certainly would have foreshadowed some of what happened in the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s. And it would have been an interesting national debate because he was serious about it. And one thing about Richard Nixon, he was dead serious about things, too serious for his own good in a way. But he was determined to bring this debate to the fore and attack the Washington bureaucracy and shrink the size of government and dismantle the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and to start reforming the welfare state to make it, in his view, more efficient, return more power to the states. This is a very ambitious agenda. Internationally, he was, he'd already had the opening to China. He had détente going with the Soviet Union. He wanted to set up, with Henry Kissinger, a balance of power system that was stable. They'd already started in the Middle East to transform that, and Kissinger continued to do that. But he had an ambitious foreign policy agenda. This is a long way of saying that it's at least possible that he would have built a pretty positive legacy in a second term, or a significant legacy that would have secured his place in history, not as the Watergate president, but as a transformative conservative president.
I don't want to go too far afield here, but I wanted to ask Evan, as long as I've got him right next to me. So how do you square that with the EPA and OSHA and wage and price controls?
Fair question. There's a whole school of thought that Nixon was a closet liberal, because if you go down the list of all the stuff he did, OSHA and EPA and a lot of environmental stuff, war on cancer, he had introduced healthcare reform, a healthcare reform bill that looks a lot like what Obama ended up doing a quarter of a century later. So how do you square that? Well, this is a kind of a mushy answer. Nixon delegated a lot to John Ehrlichman, who was pretty liberal. Ehrlichman ran the Domestic Affairs Council and was an environmentalist, and so they did fairly liberal things in that first term, while Nixon was paying more attention to foreign policy. That's part of the answer. Part of the answer is the zeitgeist of the time was pretty big government. I mean, that's where Congress was. That's where their heads were. They were passing legislation. Nixon, in the environment, was trying to steal a march on Muskie, his potential foe in 1972. He saw in 1970 Muskie was coming on as the Green candidate, Earth Day, and Nixon, who loved to confound his enemies, favorite Nixon expression, he's going to confound his enemies. He wanted to outflank Muskie by taking the lead on the environment. But once he did that, he vetoed some environmental legislation that he thought was too costly. So he at once was propelling the environment forward, but also at the same time checking a classically Nixonian, complicated move. So it's a fair question, because if you just look at all the things he did, it sounds pretty liberal.
You know, the panelists tonight made me vow to not quiz them on Andrew Johnson's impeachment. So I will not do that, but I know we're running out of time. I want to make sure that I do at least ask one question in terms of broader American history and how this all fits within it. Of course, we do have the Johnson and the Clinton impeachments. We have other major scandals, Iran-Contra and so forth. How does Watergate and the president's resignation fit within that broader scope of American history? And maybe one specific question, that do you know of other presidents that have considered resignation for one reason or another? Perhaps did Wilson consider resignation after his stroke, or did Ike after his heart attacks and stroke?
Ike, I should know the answer to this question because I just wrote a biography of him. I think he thought after his heart attack in 1955, he was so sick it was possible that he couldn't go on. But people don't easily give up power. And even after they've had a major heart attack, within a month, Eisenhower not only thought that he could serve out his first term, but was more eager than ever to do a second term. He thought about his own mortality and decided that he was indispensable to the nation. And Ike was a modest guy in many ways, I like to say he had the confidence to be humble. He was He was humble in many ways, but he thought he was when you think about it, anybody who runs for president has to think they're pretty indispensable. You don't do it unless you think you're the man or the woman. So it's pretty hard to voluntarily give that up.
Yeah.
Let's talk real quick about, there's a wonderful book recently, The President's Club, and the post-resignation Richard Nixon. Would any of you like to comment on how his resignation affected post-resignation Nixon and his relationship with those presidents, Reagan and so forth?
We sure worked on it. One thing I really admire about Nixon, despite the title of our talk this evening about resignation, he was not a quitter. Boy, was he not a quitter. And he said, interestingly, he couldn't stand Teddy Kennedy, the Kennedys loomed large to Nixon for a lot of reasons that you can understand. In fact, he thought correctly that John F. Kennedy had basically stolen the election in 1960. There's a lot of historical proof to suggest that that's true. So he didn't like the Kennedys. But to Teddy Kennedy, when Teddy Kennedy drives off the bridge at Chappaquiddick, Nixon takes him aside and says, you don't lose unless you quit. You're not defeated unless you quit. And that was a core, animating, driving notion for Richard Nixon. You don't lose unless you quit. And so after he's been disgraced, driven from office, he damn near dies. A nurse is slapping him in the face saying, "Wake up, Richard." He's that sick. But he comes back. He writes his book. He does Frost Nixon. He writes 8 books. Yeah. He starts advising presidents, unsolicited. Yeah. Starts sending them very smart memoranda about Russia and about the world. And at first, Carter pushes him away, and Reagan does start to pay attention, a little wary about it. They're a little wary about even having Nixon in the White House because he's been disgraced. And yet, over time, because of his intelligence and because of he's deeply prepared, he never stops working, he becomes an important advisor.
A good relationship with Clinton.
Bill Clinton loved him.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton thought he was great.
There are practical considerations, too. I mean, he left the White House. He was in debt and needed desperately to sign a big book contract soon, he felt, in order to make some money. And he got, when he was in San Clemente, he got Irving Swifty Lazar to get him a $2 million book deal. And once he was assured that he had access to his papers, he could see a way forward. But he had to write those books, at least in part, to earn some money.
The third memoir, interestingly enough, the resignation per se doesn't even really figure into it. It's the farewell to the White House staff, it's the near-death experience, and the rebuilding of his financial, emotional, physical health. He starts in Beijing in '72, and then he's Friday of going to the helicopter, and so it's about that rebirth, that never quitting, never giving up, that becomes the mantra.
I know they're telling me we have just a little bit of time before we want to go to the audience for your questions, but again, a very broad question perhaps to end our discussion here, and something I thought a lot about as I prepared for this evening. Why did we ever get to this place in the first place? Why did Richard Nixon, admittedly a brilliant man, a political warrior, with great success throughout his career, get to a point where he was forced to resign from an office that he had pursued his entire life?
Great question.
Let's
I have an answer. I do have a theory.
Well, we can partly,
difficult.
I think, find the answer in looking at his farewell speech when he famously said, "Others may hate you, but if you hate them, you destroy yourself." I mean, he was so obsessed, I think, with his, and it came out in terms of a fear of leaks out of the White House, which led to the plumbers unit, which led to the break-ins, which led to his ultimate demise. But he was just obsessed with his enemies. And I think, as he said to Frost, I believe, I gave them a sword and they stuck it in me, and I'd have done the same thing to them. So
But, you know,
I think it was, at least in part, it was a very obviously contentious, difficult time in our history, and he became obsessed with defeating his enemies, and he went over the edge.
You look at others. I mean, certainly someone like LBJ certainly had people he didn't like.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so it's not like others were different that much in that degree. So
Well,
it's still a very difficult
There are
question to answer.
two other pieces of the puzzle, and it is a puzzle.
Yes.
Nobody solved it,
Right.
but two other pieces. Yes, he was obsessed with his enemies, but he was not terribly self-aware about the consequences of that. Famously, as he leaves the office, his last words are, as Barry has said, if you hate your enemies too much, it's going to destroy you. But you won't find much evidence either before or after of him having that epiphany. I mean, it's too bad, because he should have, had he been more self-aware that if you hate your enemies too much, it'll come back to bite you, he might not have gotten himself into the trouble of Watergate. This is speculative, but self-awareness does matter. Now, I should say, most great people are not self-aware. If they were self-aware, they wouldn't be great. Think about it. I mean, to get up in the morning and go out and run the world, you have to have a certain amount of denial and blinkers on. I'm the greatest, and I'm going to solve all these problems. And if you think too much about how you're not that, you're not going to do it. So this little, sorry, I apologize for being circular about this, but Nixon was not terrifically self-aware. The other problem, and I think the most immediate problem, to answer your question, why did he? Richard Nixon was brave in so many ways. Going to China was a very brave thing. His whole political life is soaked in courage, but he was very uncomfortable with controversy right in front of him. If he was sitting here and we were all angrily disagreeing with each other, that would be uncomfortable for Richard Nixon, especially if he was chairing the meeting. Dwight Eisenhower, on the other hand, at national security meetings, loved debate. He would bring in everybody, and everybody would fight like hell, and Eisenhower would switch sides. You didn't even know which side he was on. He would stimulate debate by changing sides. Richard Nixon did not like controversy in front of him. He liked controversy in many ways, but not in front of him. And so, when Watergate starts to happen, he does not force his aides, his assistants, his principals to get in the room, close the door, and say, okay, what happened here? And we're going to, no, we're not leaving this room until we figure this out. Instead, he has all these conversations, and you can all listen to them because it's on tape, where he'll say to Haldeman, you think Mitchell knew? And Haldeman will sort of answer him, and then the conversation will tail off. And this happens again and again and again, but never, not until March 22nd, 1973, when it's too late, does he get the principals into one room, and by then they're so incriminated and in such trouble, they're all lying and heading for the hills, and it's too late. But so his inability to confront his problems face to face cost him dearly.
Or understanding even the gravity of the problem as other people saw it. I mean, something he said to Frost was, we did the big things rather well, and he called Watergate a pipsqueak matter. So coming too late to realization that was not quite the way it was playing out.
And in fairness, it did seem like a political thing at first. Now it seems all legal. Obstruction of justice, perjury. But that's not the way they were looking at it in the first month. They were not thinking about it. They didn't use words obstruction of justice or perjury. They're thinking about containment. It's politics. Everybody does it. Everybody spies on everybody else. Johnson spied. Kennedy spied. Bobby was always ordering up wiretaps. So you have to be a little forgiving, certainly at the outset, that they just didn't take it seriously.
Right.
Well, I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative here and ask one more question, because this is the 40th anniversary of the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act. I believe today is. Is that right, Ida? That's passage in Congress. So as we get ready for the audience questions, Barry, perhaps, I know you talk about the papers. Papers housed here at the Nixon Library now, all the materials. How were those papers viewed by Ford? If you can just briefly talk about that whole transition over and how the materials ended up at the National Archives.
A wonderful source on this is Benton Becker, who at that time was a 34-year-old former Justice Department attorney, and he volunteered to help Ford during the transition. On the second day after Nixon had flown off, Becker was charged with making sure that they knew where everything was, where the boxes were, where the tapes were, and he was walking back from the EOB to the White House, and he saw military men loading boxes that he had previously identified as Nixon's papers onto a truck. And he took it on himself to go to the gate and say, don't let that truck through. He went up to the Oval Office. He told Ford about it. Ford called in Haig. Haig claimed to know nothing about this. But the fact was that already some materials were beginning to flow out, and Ford desperately did not want to become the custodian of these materials, but he realized because of the special prosecutor's investigation that he had no choice. So they locked down the materials, and then 3 weeks later, Benton Becker is the one who flies out to California with Nixon's lawyer, Herb Miller, to negotiate the pardon, and as he's leaving, Ford says to him, you make sure that President Nixon understands that those papers have to be preserved. Now, prior to that, I think every president just took his papers with him. But because of the legal situation, that was impossible now. So as they negotiated the pardon agreement, which included a statement from Nixon about his own culpability, Ford had insisted that Becker also negotiate a deal where the United States government would become custodian for some period of time before Nixon finally got everything. And then after the pardon, there was such an uproar in Congress that they introduced the legislation that you're talking about now. So Ford saved that history for posterity, and then it was incorporated into the Presidential Materials Act.
And of course, that also then later led to the passage of the Presidential Records Act,
Right.
which my library operates under. It says anything the President creates as part of his official duties comes to the National Archives automatically at the end of administration. So it really changed how those materials were viewed.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, please join me in thanking our panel. Now we'd love to hear from you. We have two wonderful folks back here ready to pass out a microphone. If you have a question, I'll call you out and we'll go from there. Yes, sir, right down here in the front. If we can start down here. They're bringing a microphone to you. Wait 1 sec. There you go. There you go.
It was said that that Mr. Nixon had discussed things with his family towards the end of July and beginning of August. Are there any comments about what was going on in the family at that time, right up to the resignation? Mrs. Nixon, I recall, looked very drawn during the last couple of days. So could you review any personal comments about what was going on with the family at that time?
Sure. The daughters, both the daughters and Mrs. Nixon didn't want him to resign. They were the last holdouts. Julie, I guess, I'm trying to remember this. Julie heard that he was thinking about going and rushes back and tells Mom, and she says, "Why?" And Julie says something to the effect he doesn't want to put the country through this. But they don't want him to resign. The Nixons were a very tight family in their own way, and they'd been through a lot together. The toughest one of all was Mrs. Nixon. I know she seems like a passive person in some ways, and this stupid image of her being plastic pat, all of which is not true. She was a pretty fierce warrior in her own right, and she wanted to fight right down to the bitter end.
So that Wednesday night that I was talking about, when the president and Ray Price were trading drafts back and forth, Nixon goes to his bedroom to sleep and finds a note from Julie on his pillow saying, please just wait a week or 10 days. Go through the fire a little bit longer. You're so strong. Millions support you. And so the family, up to the end, would have been completely supportive of
the sons-in-law were a little squishier.
Right here in the middle. Right here. Come on.
at any time did Nixon or any of his advisors suggest destroying the tapes?
Yes. There was a little window there. The tape, this is the summer of 1972, and Alex Butterfield reveals the existence of these tapes. And Nixon has got pneumonia. Nixon had probably the healthiest modern president of all, never went to the hospital. He got pneumonia, understandably, under the stress of all this. And so he's quite sick. And they have a couple of days to decide what to do. Once the subpoenas arrive, you can't destroy the tapes. But there are a couple of days where they could have. And Spiro Agnew, of all people, suggests having a bonfire. And that was probably the right advice.
Yeah.
That was probably... Leonard Garment, who's a lawyer, says, no, that would be obstruction. We can't do that. And I think I'm a little murky about this, but my impression is that Nixon regretted that they didn't burn those tapes, and they probably could have gotten away with it. It would have been an enormous storm, but my own guess is his presidency would have survived if they had destroyed the tapes, because those tapes I don't mean to monopolize things. Those tapes were devastating to him.
Yeah. The famous 20-minute answer to Frost, the first question, why didn't you burn the tapes, finally ends with what I think is the baseline, which is Nixon didn't believe that he would be called upon to give them up, that he was going to be able to keep them.
It's a great irony that he had removed the taping system, right, and then put it back in. Yes, is that correct? And then
And removed
the Johnson system, and then yes.
He didn't put it in until February 71. It's pretty late in the game.
Yes, sir. Right back here.
You were going to talk a little bit, or you're going to ask questions a little bit about the impact of this on future presidents,
yes,
and maybe our current president. And I'd like maybe to ask you to take a few minutes, maybe to give your ideas about that. And one thing I would like, maybe if you could consider how Nixon was unable to get through his scandal, whereas Ronald Reagan, who had a scandal of in some ways pretty similar proportions, was able to slide by. I'm speaking of Irangate in this particular case. How that did not destroy the Reagan presidency in the same way that Watergate destroyed the Nixon presidency. So.
Yes.
Well, this is not exactly my area, but there's a little piece of this I think that I understand. One of my favorite terms of art out of the Watergate period was the modified limited hangout, which is just dribble out enough information that you hope will answer that day's news cycle, and it was a disaster for them. And I believe during Iran-Contra, and maybe somebody can add to this, that was it Jim Baker who came in?
Howard Baker.
Howard Baker.
Yes.
Howard Baker.
Howard Baker, that's right.
And they once they got on top of what was going on and realized how serious it was, I think they were much more forthcoming. And I think that probably helped save Reagan.
I think people were still exhausted from Watergate, too. They really didn't want to do this again. There are little things. Oliver North was a good witness, particularly because the congressional staffers, you remember Oliver North was the colonel who was involved in the heart of Irangate, which is basically trading. How did this work? They sold arms to Iran and took the money and gave it illegally to the Contras, I think was the nut of it, and then lied about it. But the guy at the middle of all this, who was running this whole operation, Oliver North, was a good witness. And the questioner, John Niels, was not so great, as I recall, in those hearings. And so public opinion quickly rallied around North and Reagan. But beyond that, there was tremendous goodwill for Ronald Reagan in the country, and less so for Richard Nixon.
It's also a foreign policy issue, which presidents had been given great latitude on. The foreign policy issue in the articles of impeachment with Nixon was one of the two voted down, the bombing of Cambodia. So that played into it as well.
Interesting.
And very patient right back here, right in the last one. Then we'll make our way down here, I promise. I love there are a lot of questions. Thank you. Yes.
Yes, you speak of Nixon, he's not a quitter, and so he accomplished a lot. EPA, Clean Water Act, and he had Kissinger kind of in his shadow. For Nixon would like to be thought of as an internationalist. And look what he had with Russia and the Mideast, went to China. It seemed like he wouldn't quit. I would think Kissinger would say, Dick, don't hang it up. We can change the world. We can do a lot. Do you have any feeling about that? Did Kissinger have much of a role in navigating Nixon, trying to keep him in office?
By the end, Kissinger wanted Nixon to go and was working with Al Haig to get him out of there because I think he thought that Nixon had been too hurt as president, basically was no longer credible on the world stage. And Kissinger, not a shy fellow himself, by then thinks that he is a force in his own right and could work, I guess, with Jerry Ford or whoever the successor is to accomplish many of the same things. The principal negotiator in the Middle East is Henry Kissinger. It's really Nixon is involved, but Kissinger's the man. Kissinger's sort of doing it himself by this stage.
All right, right here. We'll go make our way down front. There you go. No, I'll come over here, I promise. Yes, sir.
It's more clear to me of what the president's involvement was in the cover-up. It's not so clear to me what his involvement was prior to the break-in. I was wondering if someone could comment about that.
Yeah, he didn't know about the break-in. He was innocent. His guilt, if we want to talk about that, was he created an atmosphere in the White House in which underlings did stupid things. He wasn't directly responsible or knowledgeable of it. He did get involved in the cover-up, but in the break-in himself, he was surprised by it and wondered, what the hell are they doing breaking into the Watergate? They're not going to find anything there that's even worthwhile. So he was innocent in that sense, but historians would argue, I think most of them, that there was an unhealthy atmosphere at the White House that permitted, I mean, to me, it boils down to how G. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt were allowed to run amok doing these things, why somebody, not Nixon because he's at a higher level, but why one of his lieutenants didn't fire those guys. They broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office the year before, made a hash of that. They were the gang that couldn't shoot straight, and yet they're still on the payroll doing these nutty things. Somebody should have fired those guys a year before and did not. And although Nixon doesn't know about that, he bears the responsibility.
Not that Nixon was averse to break-ins. I mean, you can listen on the tape to him saying to Colson after, during the same period of the Ellsberg break-in, I want you to go into the Brookings Institution. I want you to blow the safe and get everything out of there and slam them in the press. And then as if it wasn't enough that he said it that night, he repeated it again the next morning.
Yeah, he said it three times.
All on the tapes. So, and you can say maybe he was being hyperbolic and somebody along the line should have said, let's not take this at face value.
Well, in fact, that happened in that case. I mean, one thing that's complicated about Nixon is that he did have these effusions. You can go down to the reading room here and read a lot of Nixon going, do this, do that. And his aides know enough not to do it. One of the jobs of a good aide is to let your boss vent and not do it. And Henry Kissinger understood this. Kissinger told me a story of the first summer. Nixon, after a plane had been hijacked and taken to and Nixon said, bomb the airport. And Kissinger didn't know what the hell to do, and they actually moved an aircraft carrier into place. And then he realized, he's just blowing off steam. He doesn't need it. And the top aides basically understood this, that break into Brookings, they didn't do it. Yeah. It was the next level down that was more susceptible to this. They didn't know that Nixon didn't really mean it. They didn't deal with them on a daily basis. And that was that level, Magruder, Dean, that level, it's more dangerous for them.
Down front here on this side, guys. Right over here.
it was mentioned that you saw Nixon's resignation as sort of a culmination of the 60s and the rebellion to authority. Could you please go into that a little further? It's kind of hard to see that, personally.
This is a theory I'm floating, so bear with me here. To me, the 60s are about assaults on authority. Civil rights movement, women's movement, the campuses blowing up, the draft, all that. It just energized a spirit of revolt and defiance of authority. And it took a particularly strong hold in the press. The press went from being very benign, sympathetic to authority, lazy in the early 60s. By the late 60s and early 70s, the press has been invigorated by Vietnam, by Johnson lying to them in Vietnam. They are much more defiant. They're much more likely to question authority. They're much cockier. Woodward and Bernstein, Ben Bradley at the Washington Post, those guys want to take some names. And that's a different press corps than existed in the early 60s. And that's the fruits of the 1960s. Vietnam in particular, and President Johnson lying to the press and the credibility gap in the 1960s. But it's to me, it's a lot of rivers all running together. That all institutions by 1969 were under one kind of assault or not. Look at the photographs: kids with hair down to their shoulders, and demonstrations everywhere, campuses closing. And Nixon had the bad luck to be president while this was going on.
Question right down front here.
Thank you. It's been very interesting. You haven't said a great deal about the press and the media. As a journalist myself, I've been interested to think whether or not any of that would have happened if it were a Democratic president. Because today there's scandal on top of scandal on top of scandal, and the media looks the other way, and at the beginning of the process with this candidate, no vetting was done. His background was completely swept under the rug. So what have you got to say about the journalists? I know you folks are in that realm, so you may not want to tell tales. I don't know. Thank you.
I'm happy to, but...
No, you go ahead, Evan.
was a card-carrying member of the group you're talking about. I worked for the Washington Post company for 24 years. I have said this publicly many times. There is and was a liberal bias in the media, absolutely. If you went to editorial meetings at Newsweek, you saw it. 9 out of 10 people who work for Newsweek voted Democratic. Now, having said that, the main bias in the institution I worked for was not for Democrats, it was for conflict. We like conflict, and we were quite happy to attack Democrats if there was conflict involved, or to put this in a less cynical note, abuse of power. My organization, I won a big award in the Lewinsky case. That was going after a Democratic president because he was up to no good, and we caught him. We can argue, and I think it was correct. This country decided that he shouldn't be impeached for it, but that was the press going after a Democrat. So just two things. One is, you're right, there is a liberal bias in the press. Fox News has profited mightily from this. Roger Ailes of Fox News has made billions of dollars for Rupert Murdoch by appealing to a genuine and legitimate public dissatisfaction with the East Coast liberal media. So I think that we live in a capitalist country, and it's worked pretty well to run against the liberal media. So all of that's true. But the press is a pretty equal opportunity basher, in my experience. If they see the abuse of power, they're going to go after it. They see wrongdoing, no matter who's doing it, they're going to go after it. You can argue about this. There is an argument that the press has been too soft on Obama. I guess you share this view. I do too. I agree with you, but I don't think it's egregious. But I don't disagree with that.
All right. We'll have time for one more question, I'm afraid. We'll do right here on the front row.
I was just curious what the reaction was of China with Nixon's resignation, considering his visit there, and also the international community's reaction.
Great question. Gentlemen?
I'm sorry, I'm talking too much here. China loved Nixon and welcomed him back. That was his first foreign trip. He saw Mao again before he died. I think that part of the world was puzzled that Watergate could be happening at all. I mean, the Russians really didn't understand it. Yeah. What? And it cost us some, but America has tremendous resilient power. And so there was a certain amount of hand-wringing, I think, at the time in foreign capitals, and certainly in Beijing. But the enduring power and presence and essential nature of the United States transcended that. And before too long, the United States had asserted its place or reasserted it. Really never lost its place, along with a lot of grumbling and complaining and whining about it, which always goes on. But the United States was in 1974 the essential nation, and still is.
All right. With that, I want to thank our terrific panelists, our hosts, and all of you for being here. Thank you all very much. Thanks to our hosts at the Nixon Library. Thank you.